It's straight up 1 o'clock. I'm getting the high sign from the back of the room. So I'll get started. Welcome. My name is Tim, and I do network penetration testing for the SpiderLabs division of Trustwave. And I want to talk for a bit about something that I call attack taxonomies. The basic idea is what are the kinds of attacks that we do, and in particular what I do for my day job. Internal attacks, attacks on internal networks driven by humans. That's going to be the focus, and I'm trying to make sense of this stuff. So there's just a little bit about who I am. I've been doing this InfoSec thing for a while now, and feel I've got to a point where I can get on a soapbox just for a minute if you are someone who's trying to break into this field, or into any field really. Just 2 little bits of advice. Find what it is that you love to do and do it as much as you can. Find what it is you love to do it as much as you can. But temper that with whatever it is you happen to be doing. Kick ass at it. Because unfortunately we can't always be doing what we love to do. So I'm going to break this into 3 sections. It's pretty straightforward. I want to talk about how other folks have talked about attack taxonomies. And then I want to present a sketch of one that I think would be more suitable to my needs as a penetration tester on internal networks. And I think it also has some value to folks that are trying to defend those networks. So I want to try to flesh that out a little bit. So I'll talk about the history, I'll give a sketch of my view, and then try to pull some implications out of that. Now, why am I doing this? Well, there's a few things that inspired me to just go down this road. One is that, the team of folks that I work with, we're producing findings on internal networks all the time, and we're, to some extent, cataloging those. This is just a snippet of a view of our SpiderLabs Global Security Report from 2011. And so there's a lot of things in the report beyond just penetration testing, but one of the things that gets covered there is sort of just an inventory of what kinds of vulnerabilities are we exploiting most frequently. And so, that got me thinking, well, what would a bigger list look like and how would we organize it? But really, at the end of the day, my motivations here is about making my work more effective. So I'm trying to organize the stuff that I do and be able to apply it faster and be complete. So not miss over things that that should be tested for. And I'm also looking at how to look at all these attack types and figure out which of these things can be automated and what are the implications of that, and trying to build automation into this process. So when I put these slides together, I realized I didn't really have a thesis, so I added one. This is not something I'm maybe particularly emotionally wedded to, but I think it's true, and I think what I'm going to talk about backs it up. It's simply this, that defenders focused on Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, scores are misallocating their security dollars, both in regard to defensive technology solutions as well as proactive security testing. So one of the things I want to do is kind of pick on CVSS and say, this is all great from a defender's perspective, but if you put an attacker's hat on and look at these things, different qualities, different metrics about attacks and vulnerabilities come to light. And I want to shift our attention to those. So if you Google around on attack taxonomy, there's a long history. There's a lot of, especially academic work on the topic. But basically, first of all, what is a taxonomy? Think of it as like a cookbook, really. So think of like if you've are familiar with the O'Reilly series of texts in the technical world, like the Perl cookbook, Ruby cookbook, and so on, right? They're organized, you're just a real cookbook, right, from your kitchen, organized in chapters by topic, right? Desserts, entrees, or in the case of like the Perl cookbook, you've got string manipulation, file access, network access. So these kind of topics that break up the realm under discussion. And then within those chapters, you've got a series of recipes, kind of little how-to guides to perform specific tasks, and they're arranged in a particular order that I think it has a kind of a pedagogical purpose. It's to learn the stuff. You start simple and work up to the more complex. And so I want to apply that kind of approach to the world of attacks. Other folks have done it already, and the different attack taxonomies that exist, they have, so really to make your taxonomy, you choose a set of metrics and you apply it to the domain. Well, the metrics you choose determine the resulting taxonomy. So there are some out there that focus on weaknesses in code, right? Vulnerabilities in code, bugs. And those are, geared toward the development community. If you're writing code, that's the kind of stuff you want to focus on. If you are an owner of systems, if you manage systems, you want to know for these different attacks and vulnerabilities, what's the impact to me, right? Is this going to ruin my business? Is this going to be a loss of data? Is it going to cause system downtime? Right? So that's the kind of focus for those taxonomies. But there's other more kind of esoteric ones, like some that are focused on intrusion detection, signature-based detection, and even arranging attacks by what's the computational complexity of spending the resources to detect a particular attack. So, like I said, the attack taxonomies are kind of esoteric and academic. They're not, I think, commonly known in kind of the workaday field of information security. But another realm that I think is much more familiar to us is the weighting schemes and metrics that we apply to vulnerability databases. So think of all the vulnerabilities that Microsoft publishes on a monthly basis and the kind of metrics Microsoft puts on those to help you sort out, well, which of these things do I need to react to today versus this quarter versus this year, or the open source vulnerability database, this index of CVEs, right? So just a quick look at some of these. So here's this is the definition from Microsoft's page where they describe how they rate their patches as being critical, important, moderate. The basic idea is, I think, to figure it out, start with important. A vulnerability is important if its exploitation could result in the compromise of the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. If those things could be harmed and it's relatively straightforward to exploit, then they rate it as important. If it's important but exploitation is kind of hard, then they rate it as moderate. And if it's important, if the exploitation is really hard, then it gets the rating low. And then they have this special case scenario up at the top there for if it's if it affects CIA and it's wormable, then it gets this critical rating. Here's another one. I don't think this one is seen very often. I pulled it off of the CERT site, right? Everyone knows who CERT is. But I don't want to focus on like the number, the math of it, but just the concepts here. So what kind of metrics is CERT looking at? Is the vulnerability widely known? Is it being actively exploited? Is the internet infrastructure at risk because of it? How many systems are affected? What's the impact? How easy is it to exploit? What are the preconditions? I just want to give you a flavor of what these folks are measuring when they look at a big list of vulnerabilities. The one I think we're most familiar with is the metrics applied to CVEs. It's the CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. So what you do, you can, if you haven't before, you can Google on CVSS calculators, and there's these nice little web pages where you just plug in answers to these questions, and it'll pop out a value of between 1 and 10, where 10 is, hey, this is really critical, and 1 is, this is not very important. The metrics that, it might be kind of hard to read, but the metrics involved here are, is it a local or remote exploit condition? Is it complex or not complex? Do you have to be authenticated to exploit it, right? Or is it pre-authentication? Does it impact the CIA triad and how much? Target distribution, so how many things are affected by it? Is there an exploit for it or not? Is it proof of concept? Is it a functional exploit? So these are the kinds of things that are out there in the measuring systems around these vulnerability databases. And I think that they all serve a purpose, and you can see where they're coming from in terms of being from the perspective of the defender of networks. In particular, the defender who is focused on internet-based attacks. I think a lot of these metrics make less sense when you think about the scenario of something on the inside of your network. I think so. I think they're all defender-centric. And what I want to do is develop an attacker-centric model. So I think they're based on vulnerabilities, but not attacks. And I want to take an attack approach. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, vulnerabilities and attacks go together, right? They're like two sides of the same coin. Well, not exactly. I think that the vulnerability databases have this sort of unexpected negative side effect of getting us into this habit of thinking of vulnerabilities as being equivalent to stuff you can patch. Right? But the world of things that are vulnerable is far greater than the world of things that can be patched. So here's a trivial proof of that. Mathematical proof. Syllogistic reasoning. You can't patch stupidity. Right? Premise. You can't patch stupidity. Line 2. You can attack stupidity. Examples are legion. Here's one. Marketing. I'm not a fan of marketers. Okay, so therefore, conclusion, there are things you can attack that you can't patch. So when you put the attack mindset on, I think it kind of opens up the world of possibilities of things that you can go after. But if you think of all the brain cycles that everyone here and throughout the world spend on the whole notion of, are we patched? What's our patch management process? What do we have to do when the patches come out this month? I mean, there's a huge amount of work and effort, blood, sweat, and tears that goes into that. But remember, that's just a fraction, right? That's not vulnerability management, it's patch management. I think the metrics that are out there ignore detectability. It's kind of interesting. Why I don't understand why detectability is not being tracked. And a notion that I'm calling safety, but think of it as reliability or repeatability. Those things aren't being measured. I'll talk in a minute about why I think they should be. And these things are all focused on internet-based attacks. So I think it's overdue that we shift our focus away from worrying about internet bots and shift the focus to humans on the inside. So I'm going to talk about, so suppose somebody were to come up with a taxonomy that was along these lines, right? I'm not going to give the taxonomy, I'm going to give like a sketch of one. What it would look like if someone were to do this work. So here's the metrics I'm proposing. I'm not going to argue that they're complete. I think there's more that would be needed. But safety, power, and visibility frequency, those are the ones that kind of they're top of mind when I'm thinking about which attacks to leverage on an internal network. So like I said, safety or reliability or repeatability, not really seen in the literature. And I think part of the reason is that defenders don't care so much whether you can attack them twice, if you can attack them once successfully. It's sort of like, for a defender, getting owned is infinitely bad. Getting owned twice is infinitely bad plus one. But from an attacker's point of view, it's the opposite. If I can own you once, that's great. But if I can own you twice and 3 times and forever, that's really great. Here's one reason why. If, and this is going to be kind of a theme that I think makes some of the existing schemes a little bit simplistic. Attacks are rarely simple. A attacks B, done, end of story. They're usually composite. They usually have segments. A attacks B, you move from B to attack C, and that could go on for any number of legs in links in a chain. If you need to move along these links in a chain, then the reliability of these intermediate points is critical, is crucial, right? If I need to attack the web server to get to the database server, but every time I attack the web server, it falls over, I'm not going to be able to attack the database server. I need the web server to stay up for me, right? So that's critical. And notice how, from just the point of view of doing penetration testing, as a penetration tester, you want your attacks to be safe because you don't want to piss off your client. The client wants them to be safe as well, right? But an attacker in the similar situation, right, also wants attacks to be safe. It's not because they care about whether the client gets pissed off or not, but it's part about being invisible. So these things converge. Okay, power. What I mean by power is not what the other metrics refer to by impact. So the other systems that are out there often measure impact, and it's like, how bad is this thing to me? Is it going to cause a loss of data? How much? And that's all well and good, but I think, again, if we look at this attacks being a series of links in a chain, intermediate points along that chain could have a low impact if you were to measure the vulnerabilities being exploited there. But the power, what I'm calling power, could be very high because the power is about how much leverage an attack gets you. So if I exploit a vulnerability to compromise the web server, and it happens to be a vulnerability rated with a low impact because there isn't any sensitive data on the web server, but it allows me to bounce through that to attack the backend database. Well, what I'm saying is that intervening attack point has a high power value, gives you a lot of leverage over the network. Invisibility, that's straightforward. It's the converse, right, of detectability. And then frequency, again, is how common does this vulnerability occur? And this, I think, lines up pretty well with the other metrics that are out there. But basically, from an attacker's point of view, you want to know, should I be spending my time tracking this down? What's the chance I'm actually going to run into it? So now I want to step through, just real quick, what a sketch of the taxonomy along these lines might look like, and give just a couple quick examples. the background assumptions here, I'm talking about internal networks only, but I'm not talking about insider attacks, right? I'm not talking about disgruntled employees, folks that have access, right? In those situations, you're hosed. So I'm talking about a compromised desktop, say, right? Employee browses wrong website, gets drive-by download. They're now being remotely controlled from somebody outside the company. Or you can think of similar scenarios with wireless attacks. So rogue hardware not necessary. Think compromised desktop. I'm trying to keep things very simple because I'm just starting to wrap my head around this stuff. So physical wireless social attacks not covered. I'm assuming we're already in. And similarly, things that come later, like privilege escalation, pivoting, data extraction, not covered yet. So if I were to write a cookbook for this stuff, these are the chapters I would have. I've bracketed reconnaissance and privilege escalation and data extraction. I'm going to set those aside, maybe get to those later. But these other chapters are just the way I think about, when I find myself on an internal network, this is how my thoughts are organized. So for the first three of these, I'm just going to give a quick little sample. And so here's the first one. Attacks against anonymous services. Here's just a quick list of some example attacks against services that are anonymous intentionally, or in the case of that old real VNC bug, unintentionally anonymous. They're on this list because we use them. Me and my teammates use them on a regular basis. The list would change over time, right? Some things are current, some things are old, some things never die. So like the VMware directory traversal bug, a couple of years ago, that we were running into that all the time. It was becoming rarer a year ago, and now I don't think it's been a long time since I've seen it. Folks are generally patching for that, I guess. NetBIOS null sessions, though, have been around since, I'm not a Windows historian, a long time. And I've thrown some numbers on here for the different things I'm measuring, right? Safety, power, invisibility, frequency. And I don't want to get into a fight about these numbers. I mean, at the end of the day, they're kind of silly, but I think the same is true for all the metric systems that are out there. But they help you, I think, put things in a little bit of perspective. The stuff that has these low scores should percolate to the top of your list. Right? They're things that are safe and reliable. You should be able to run them without harm, and chances are good you'll get stuff, right? So, when I first threw this list together, things weren't ordered this way. And I actually, learned some things about how to organize the attacks I carry out. Let me give you one example in a little bit more depth of why I've thrown some of these numbers down. So, NetBIOS null sessions. I'm saying they're safe. There's zero risk to a target system from this attack. In fact, it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? It's by design. In fact, when I was having some back and forth with my teammate about this stuff, they were saying, well, that's not a vulnerability. And that's that patch mindset, right? It is an attack. So how can it not be a vulnerability? It's maybe a configuration weakness, let's call it. Your systems should be hardened against this, even if there's no patch that turns it off. The power I've rated as 2. Things that I rate as power 1 usually give you access to a system, or they give you credentials, right? This doesn't get you that, well, usually. How many people have ever looked at dumps from a Windows domain user list, and there's the description field, right? And seeing things like temp user Joe password is password 123 in the description field. So it happens, but usually not. That's the extreme case. But the data that you get from those null session queries can be immensely valuable. I'm thinking in particular of domain group membership lists, right? So who's a member of what group in your domain? There's in terms of attacking your network, there's little data that's more valuable than that. So who are the domain admins? Well, I'm going to target them. Or suppose I have some funky group of users that have some special privilege that I want to go after. Maybe a database administrator. So who is a member of the most groups? That might be a useful set of people. Or who is a member of the group with the fewest members? Right, these are some little bits of analysis you can run against this data, and interesting people in your company are going to pop up. Invisibility, it's certainly detectable, but in practice it's never detected. I don't think I've ever had a client come to me and say, oh, we nailed you when you did that null session query. And the occurrence rate, this is just a swag. I mean, I'm saying greater than 90% of the time it works, it hasn't been disabled. And that's simply because, just on reflection, when I'm in an environment where the attack fails, I'm shocked. It's that rare. It's a surprise when it doesn't fly. Next, attack against weak credentials. This is like default accounts, where there's a well-known list of common default usernames and passwords, or the password's null, the password's same as the username, situations like that. So the notorious ones here are Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle. Earlier versions of Oracle, you can go out and download lists of, it's in the hundreds of default accounts, usernames and passwords that can be living in the database. But I want to take just a quick little dive into Microsoft SQL Server. It's a perfect example of this problem. The exploit's very safe. The only time you run into issues in terms of safety with these kinds of exploits is really password locking issues, account lockouts. Right? You want to make sure that you don't, as a pen tester, you want to make sure you don't do that. And as an attacker, similarly. That's a really quick way to alert defenders that shit's going on when a whole bunch of people start saying my account got locked, or an administrative user, their account suddenly gets locked. A little light's going to go on in their head, and they might start looking at log files. But in this case, it's fairly rare. In the case of Microsoft SQL Server, if it's not doing integrated authentication, or it's authenticating to the domain in the back end, that generally means a DBA had to go in there and manually set this stuff up, and I rarely see it. The power is immense, and I don't think database or owners of SQL Server or owners of networks fully appreciate what this vulnerability means. Because if I can log into your SQL Server with the SA account in a default configuration I'm running in the context of the system account, I can run arbitrary commands on the operating system. I can dump credentials out of the local SAM file, local credential stores. I can dump hashes out of memory. And this is where things really start to pay off for me, because the credentials that we find in memory are the hashes of domain accounts of users who've logged into the box recently. And who logs into database servers? Database administrators, or sysadmins, domain administrators. So if I can find SA accounts in your environment of any kind, on any system, prod, test, development, in some lab somewhere, chances are going up exponentially that I'm going to be able to own your domain. Easily detectable, but rarely detected again. It depends on how you do it, right? If you're running a giant dictionary attack of common usernames and passwords, that's going to eventually trigger some alarms, because one of the first things people do with things like internal security information management systems is look for failed login attempts. But if you target it very narrowly, so I would say of all the times I've compromised an SA account, 99% of the time, the password was either SA or null. So that's 2 guesses. That's not going to attract a lot of attention. And F is 1. It's so common, it's an embarrassment to our industry. So if nothing else, right, walk away with this. I don't happen to use the Nmap NSE, the Nmap scripting engine script here, ms-sql-brew. I use other tools, but this one was a lot easier to put on a slide. So everyone knows Nmap, right? Nmap is awesome. And now with the NSE scripts that are coming out all the time, you can do all kinds of additional cool stuff. Here's an NSE script that will test for default SA accounts. It's a one-liner. You have to create a username dictionary and a password dictionary, but I recommend that the username dictionary has 1 element in it, SA, and the password dictionary has 2, SA and null. Run that against all your systems, regularly, because I think this is a problem. Why we run into this so often is people think of, and I'm thinking when I say people, third-party application producers or third-party software products, off-the-shelf software. Think of this kind of database as an embedded database. This is my suspicion of what's going on, right? It gets put into stuff. You buy it, you don't even know you have it. It pops up on your network. Another common scenario is, some developer just throws up an instance on their desktop and they forget about it. The next chapter would go into man-in-the-middle attacks. And here's some of the more common ones. I'm going to step into ARP cache poisoning in just a little bit of detail because it is so common to exploit and it's so valuable. It is a jumping off point to a number of other attacks that leverage the fact that you're a man in the middle. So I say that ARP cache poisoning has a high safety level, and I think that's not appreciated in the industry because there seems to be a tendency, and if you go and find some intro guides to how to do this attack, they tend to assume that it targets the entire local network. And so there's this notion that these kinds of attacks have to target network infrastructure and lots of systems. But that's not the case. They can be very finely tuned and target individual systems. So for example, a common scenario I get into is through network reconnaissance, I see some database servers on the local network and I suspect they're talking to each other. That maybe one's a mirror of the other, they're backing up each other. So if I can poison those two systems' ARP caches and become a man in the middle between them, I've only affected those two systems. It's not really a network infrastructure attack per se, right? I'm going right after those boxes. And I suddenly have gobs and gobs of network traffic. The power I rate is 1 because in addition to kind of all these other secondary attacks, sometimes you get great data right in the data stream you're intercepting. So I'm thinking of things like clear text credentials, authentication credentials, telnet, FTP, POP, that kind of stuff, right? So you get those passwords. That's all free. You might get valuable data going down the wire. That definitely happens. Again, it's detectable but rarely detected. And it's rarely defended against, but it's everywhere, right? It's if you're doing IP, you've got it pretty much. So if we imagine we had a cookbook like that, ordered in such a way, are there any morals to that story? What can we pull out of that? Here's some things I would like to do with it. So I think it sort of obviously could be used for training material as a pedagogical purpose. I mean, I started to produce this list as a way of organizing my thoughts so that I could do things better in the right order, do them better, faster, cheaper. So you begin with the simple S1, F1, so the safe and frequently occurring attacks. I highlighted the word simple here because that to me is like an obvious additional metric that could be added to my group of 4. A fifth one should be, how simple is this thing to exploit? Does it require a whole bunch of setup time and additional reconnaissance work to get all the bells and whistles lined up? Or is it, point, click, fire, done? So we can arrange this material along these lines and present it to junior members of the team, internally, externally, right? I'm not thinking specifically about third-party penetration testing teams, but also your own teams, defensive teams. Okay, input for defensive strategies. So if I was a defender, one of the takeaways is I would want to eliminate the potential for attacks that have a high safety and invisibility measure. Because those are attacks that you can't detect, or they're hard to detect, or at least not detected commonly. And they're repeatable, so they can linger. As some folks say nowadays, they can persist. Thirdly, we can use this as input for automation. So a lot of the S1, I1 attacks are automatable for attackers. If it's safe, and if you can largely remain invisible, then you may be able to automate this stuff, and that would be cool. If you're a defender, you don't care about whether it's invisible or not. So that widens the door for you a little bit. We might take some of this as input for evaluating how we're spending pen testing dollars, or at least evaluating how we're spending our InfoSec dollars. Because if you are buying penetration tests and you're getting owned by these easy attacks, then you might not be spending your money in the right way. A lot of these attacks can be remediated, or you could put controls around through configuration management. So a lot of these issues might not succumb to a patch process, but a configuration management process would help a lot. And so it might help you direct how best to spend your money. So I wanted to get into automation just a little bit. There's a couple of use cases. So in addition to penetration testing, the whole vulnerability assessment process, if these things can be automated, they might be able to get pulled into that a little bit. So there's, I think, kind of a fuzzy gray boundary between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, right? Is banner grabbing an attack? generally it's not considered an attack, right? Is pulling data over a null session query an attack? Now things are getting a little fuzzy. Is fetching data via an SA account an attack? I mean, in one sense, it's logically equivalent to banner grabbing. I mean, there's not a lot going on there. Is executing code via XP command shell stored procedure via an SA account an attack? Well, okay. I mean, we've just crossed a line somewhere, but I'm not sure where that line is. If it's automatable and poses no harm to your network, and you get all kinds of valuable data from it, why wouldn't you roll it into your vulnerability assessment practice? But since I am doing penetration testing day to day, I'm more interested in how to do my job more effectively. And so I'm going to think about how I can automate these things to provide actionable data to me as the human trying to analyze this stuff in a short time frame and provide the biggest bang for the buck for my client. So here's a couple of examples. And this first one is automating NetBIOS name service response spoofing, which is it's common, it's out there. You can Google on it, and find out how to do it, and find little scripts that to automate it for you. But basically, the way it works is Windows systems, right? They will, when they're doing name resolution, first attempt to do a local file lookup, and if that fails, they'll do a DNS lookup, and if that fails, and they're configured this way, they will initiate a NetBIOS name service query, which is a broadcast. And so all you have to do as an attacker is start listening for these broadcasts and respond to them. And say, I mean, it's like a cheap way of doing DNS poisoning. You just say, yeah, that's me. I'm Goggle.com or whatever. And often what we see from these is it's either misconfigured devices or it's mistyped URLs, right? Where the DNS lookup is failing and it's falling through the cracks to this third layer of resolution. And so now you can coax your victim into talking to you. And that leads to secondary attacks where you try to get them to do NTLM authentication or otherwise coax some Windows credentials out of them. And so, we could sit down, beginning a test, and we fire this up, and we start listening for these things, we start responding to them, and suddenly we have a list that starts scrolling down the screen of, hey, we've got this hash, we've got this hash, we've got this hash for this user. And we just, dump those into rainbow tables, and now we have usernames and passwords popping out. So, hey, that's really easy. A second example, slightly more complicated. First, we do our network reconnaissance and find all of our Microsoft SQL servers. And we find if they have default SA accounts. And if we can get in with the SA account, we run gsecdump on them and we get all the credentials out of memory and that are locally stored on that. And then on this other track over here, we do null session queries and we dump the domain data and we figure out who's a member of what group. So I've been building up little scripts along these lines over the years, and I'm starting to glue them all together so I can do this kind of thing now where I can sit down, do some initial recon, figure out what's where on the network, kind of get myself situated, fire up this script, go get some coffee, come back, and I've got a little printout saying, hey, here's some hashes that are a member of the domain admins group. Boom. Done. So I just want to leave you with some food for thought. Some of the The morals here is, what's the difference between penetration testing and real attacks? What I want to do is emphasize what's going on in real attacks to be able to model it better as a penetration tester. But I don't think we're there all the way. Pen testing is still very different from the real thing for some obvious reasons. Permission, ground rules. But I think the biggest one is the time constraint. And at least I haven't really fully appreciated that yet. And it's only recently that it's kind of hit me how much of a difference it makes. I was just imagining the situation where I'm given a project that's similar to the kind of internal attack, the internal pen test projects I'm assigned, but I'm given an indefinite time period. I can take as much time on this as I want. Totally changes the thought process that goes into how to step through the series of attacks. And normal day-to-day internal network penetration testing is incredibly time-boxed. And so I think we need to sort of, as an industry, appreciate better how that skews what's going on. I think there's also lurking in the background this difference that as a good guy, at the end of the day, I want to help my client understand all the different ways they're vulnerable. So, I'll go to a client 1 year and I'll own their network, and they get the remediation advice and we work with them and they fix it. And then I come back the next year and I own them again. And they say, but I fixed it. And I say, well, but I owned you a different way. Okay, and then I come back the third year and I own them again. But we fixed it. Well, sorry, I'm using a new technique. So they get a little annoyed, right? They don't want that, right? They want all the tests to happen forevermore and to get a complete list of all the things they might be vulnerable to. But, that's impossible. We can't do that. So I have a little talk with them about how, it's like a maze. We're at the start of the maze. There's all this valuable data at the bottom, and there's countless paths through the maze. And our goal, unlike your vulnerability assessment program, is weighted toward discovering as many paths as possible. In the penetration testing model, the weighting is put on get as far down the maze as you can. So it's irrelevant how many paths you find. If you get to the bottom, you're successful. Now, if you get to the bottom on day one and you've got a bunch of time on your hands, then sure, yeah, we want to provide as much value as we can. We're going to go back and look at some of these other avenues. But it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you're one step away from the bottom and you have a whole lot of work to do. So, for example, I've got access to this very large database. Is my target data compromised? I don't know. I have to find it. And that can take a lot of work. So, that's just another example of how, as a good guy doing this kind of testing, we try to think about all of these different avenues, but the bad guy, they've got one goal, and when they've got it, they're done. It's just a different mindset. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.